Okay, let's talk about variables. Now, this is a fairly short lecture because this is just for you to really identify what variables are. And honestly, you guys have gone through all of these in statistics, so there should be no reason that you don't understand what is going on in this chapter. Okay, this is more really for like students who really know what independent variable, what dependent variables are. So I don't believe that applies to any of you that passed the statistics class. Okay, so this is going to be more like a refreshing course. Okay, so now what is a variable? What in your book it says it's an aspect of a testing condition that can change or take on different characteristics with different conditions. So it really is like an element, factor, or feature that can change and or vary, and therefore it's why it's called a variable. Okay. Now there are the type of variables. There are independent variable, there are dependent variable, and there are variable of interest. And so let's kind of define them, and then we can go on and do some slight exercises, and you can get a better idea because these concepts are better ingrained when you apply them rather than looking at definitions. So this is why it's really important to go through your homeworks on your workbook and then try to see if you can understand uh, why something is what it is, why this is the correct answer. Okay, so this class, a lot of it is going to be based on your logic, and then in the very beginning, especially the first 2 weeks, it feels like you are really learning a new language, and it really is. You're learning the new language of research. Okay, and then unfortunately that's how it goes, and then but you'll see that as the semester goes on, by your third and then your fourth week you should get very good at doing this. Okay. Okay, so what is an independent variable? Well, in a true experiment, the variable that was manipulated. So example I give you here is caffeine consumption and attention levels. So let's say in this case, let's say if you are interested in knowing whether or not consumption of caffeine can influence someone's attention, okay, then what must be manipulated in this case would be the amount of the caffeine that is consumed. So the caffeine consumption in this case would be the independent variable, okay? And the dependent variable would be whatever or however you measure your attention level is, okay? Now, in a quasi-experiment, the independent variable is the variable that was the category was subject variable, okay? So the example I'll give you here is, let's say if your research interest is you are wondering if there are any gender differences in violent behavior episodes, okay? Then in this case, the sex of the participants or the gender differences, that would be your independent variable. Okay. Okay, now the levels of the independent variable can really, basically it's the number of the values of the independent variable that takes on. So for the example here that you see is caffeine consumption on attention score. Okay, so let's say if you have three groups of subjects and then they drink 0, 1, and 2 cups of coffee respectively, and their attention scores were measured. So this in this study's independent variable, it has three levels. There is 0, 1, and 2 cups of coffee consumed. All right, so that in this case, this study will have three levels. Okay. Okay, now quantitative versus categorical variables. Okay, now the quantitative basically varies in amount. Okay, so the quantitative variables, they are going to run on the same spectrum. So, in the categorical variable, they are going to vary in kind. Okay, so the example of the quantitative variable will be the number of cups of coffee consumed. That will be quantitative. or another name for this would be continuous variable. Okay, so that means that the number of cups, they are running on the same spectrum. Okay, 2 cups of coffee is exactly 2 times more than 1 cup of coffee. Okay, okay, now down here, let's say the type of the coffee that is consumed, Brazilian versus Costa Rican versus Ethiopian, whatever, that would be categorical, okay? Because this is varying in kind rather than the quantity of it, okay? Now, continuous and discrete variable is something that I have briefly mentioned before. Okay, so let's say continuous variable is the ones that is divisible in number and falls on the same continuum. Right? So, for instance, another example I gave you is the amount of the coffee, amount of the water that was drank. Okay, that is measurable and then it should always run on the same continuum. Okay, now the discrete variable is binned and not visible. Okay, so the example would be something like the number of marriages. Well, I mean, you cannot have 1.5 marriages, right? So, therefore, it's binned and it's not visible. Let's say number of children. Okay, you cannot say I have 1.5 children. That's just not possible. Okay. All right, so that's the difference between discrete and continuous variable. Now let's take a look at dependent variable. So the dependent variable is the readout, or if you want to think about it, it's the outcome. Okay, it's the outcome or the measurement of the behavior that is affected by the independent variable. Okay, so it's the outcome that you're interested in knowing. Okay, now the variable of interest when you are not sure the cause and effect relationship between two variables. So let's say, for instance, you are interested in knowing confidence and happiness. You're not sure if one is causing the person to be happier, what happiness is causing the person to be feel more confident about themselves. So when you're saying something like the variable of interest, very much it's very possible that you're talking about correlation. Okay, so these are all the things that you learn in stats, and it's just that in research terms, they are taking on a different name. Okay, measurement. Okay, so this is the way that you are trying to get your results. Okay, so this is the process of assigning numbers to events with subjects according to the rules. So there, see, there is that thing again, rules. Okay, so it really has to do with how you define something. Okay, now in psychology, your measurement is usually your readout of a specific behavior that is operationally defined. So the rules, so the operational definition is going to basically set out what kind of rules that you need to follow when you're making your measurement. Okay, so for instance, you are interested in knowing children that has a violent acting out aggressive behavior. Okay, so how are you going to define acting out? Well, you are going to define acting out as something like pouting, okay? And you are going to define acting out as something like biting someone with yelling someone. So all of these are I mean, there are a lot of other different ways that you can operationally define what is an acting out episode. But then it's whenever you operationally define something, then after that you need to assign them and say, these are the rules that you need to follow based on my operational definition of what acting out is. Okay, so therefore you can see that if you incorrectly were mislabeling the operational definition, and then it could be very possible that you are not looking at the correct construct. So for instance, if let's say if you are saying that if the child starts crying, that would be also a form of acting out. Oh, but how would you know they are crying because they are upset? where they're depressed versus they're crying on the top of their lungs just to get your attention. So if you're just saying crying is a form of acting out, that's not a very good operational definition because you could be assessing aggressiveness or you could be assessing depression, right? So therefore, your operational definition need to be very specific and it has a certain meaning to it. And then only after you operationally define something, then you give it a certain rule that you need to follow. Okay. Okay. Now the type of measurement scales. This is something that you had in your statistic class. So nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio. Okay. Nominal is name only. Ordinal is ranking. Interval is difference between numbers are meaningful, equal distance. And ratio is very similar to interval, but it has an absolute zero and is divisible. Okay, interval not necessarily divisible. Okay, but ratio is definitely divisible. Okay, and it definitely has an absolute zero. So now a lot of people don't know what the difference between interval and ratio is, and then this is something I just kind of want to say it out loud over here. So in interval, the zero is always arbitrary. Okay, so now if you look back in your physics or chemistry, whatever classes, okay, you know the difference between the Kelvin scale and the Celsius scale. Okay, so what is Celsius scale? What is zero mean? Okay, zero means this is the temperature that water freezes. Okay, so that zero is arbitrarily set because it could be set to anything else. It could be set to something like the temperature when gold start to melt, right? So that is very arbitrarily set. So when you think about it, the Celsius scale would be an interval scale, as opposed to the Kelvin scale. Kelvin scale, that zero of that would mean that there is absolutely no heat that is in that scale, right? So therefore, the Kelvin scale would be a ratio scale. Okay, just think about in terms of that. Okay, now let's do this exercise. Mary is interested in memory and gender. She gathers 100 people, 50% male and 50% female. She then tested their memories using an XYZ memory scale. The score of the memory scale goes from a 0 to 100 points. She tested the males in the morning and females in the afternoon. Okay, so what is the dependent variable and the independent variable? Okay, so the independent variable is what she is interested, what she is kind of assigning the values to. So based on the subject characteristic in this case, right? So the independent variable here will be the gender of the participants, male versus female. Okay, and the dependent variable is the outcome. Okay, so it's not memory. So if you say memory, that would be wrong. But what? It's the score of the memory scale. Okay, that would be the independent variable. Sorry, that would be the dependent variable. Okay, so number two, how many levels are there in the independent variable? So there'll be two, male and females. Okay, so number three, what is a confounding variable? So confounding variable is something that can really be an alternative explanation of your results if there are any differences. So the confound here would be the time of the testing. Okay, so because she tested the male in the morning and the females in the afternoon. So you don't know if the differences that you are going to see in the memory scale is due to gender, is it due to the time of day that the test was conducted, right? Number four, what is the scale of measurement for the dependent variable? Okay, so well, it's either interval or ratio, right? So now the score of the memories goes from 0 to 100 points. Well, it doesn't really tell you what the 0 represents. So we don't know if it is arbitrarily set or it is absolute 0. Okay, so it could be interval or ratio. Now, if the exercise is asking you something else, let's say she is, so the score is the memory scale that in 0 means that there are 0 items recalled. So that would make it very absolute. That means this person remembered nothing and got none of the points correct. Okay, so that would mean that if that is explicitly said in the exercise, then that would be a ratio scale. Okay. Okay, here's another one. Joe is interested in how morphine affects pain perception. He gives the 4 different groups of rats the following doses: no drug, 1 milligram, 2 milligram, and 3 milligrams per 1 kilogram of body weight. He then places the rats on a hot plate and tested how many times the rats shifted their paws. He observed the rats from the no drug and 1 milligram group, while his assistant observed the rats from the 2 milligram and the 3 milligram groups. Okay, so the independent variable and dependent variables. Okay, so the independent variable here would be not morphine, but the dosage of the morphine that was given to the rats. Okay, now, the dependent variable is what? It's not pain perception, but rather is the times that the rats shifted their paws on the hot plate. Okay? Number 2, how many levels are there in the dependent variable? So there are 4 levels. There's no drug, there's a 1 milligram, there's 2 milligrams, and 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Okay, so there are 4 levels. Number 3, what is a confounding variable? Well, Joe is doing, he is observing only 2 groups while his assistant is observing from 2 other groups, right? So this is a confounding variable because now we don't know if the differences that we're seeing is due to the drugs or is it due to the differences in the observers, right? Okay, number 4, what is the scale of measurement of the dependent variable? Okay, so now look at the nature of the dependent variable. So this is how many times the rats shifted their paws. So is it possible that the rats never shifted their paws and therefore it's a 0? And what does the 0 represent? Well, it represents the absolute absence of shifting of their paws. Therefore, well, the scale measurement will be ratio. Okay, all right, that's it for this lecture.